Hi, today I want to get away a little bit from Genesis, but realize that everything is grounded in that story. But with the Christmas season, I would like to talk about Christmas gifts. So, I've been going to church for 50 years, and I've pretty much been in church for 50 Christmases. And I've heard a lot of preachers talk about, well, I don't know about a lot of preachers. I have heard many sermons, I should say, that talked about Christmas gifts or just lessons. And it seems to me that we put a little bit of a damper on giving Christmas gifts. And today I would like to talk a little bit about that and explain my view of Christmas gifts. But before we can get into that, I need to lay a little bit of a foundation here because it tends it seems to me that we tend in Christianity to not like spiritual thing or material things, like anything that material is evil, and a lot of preaching always seems to look on the negative side, the warning against materialism, and that's rightfully so. But we are people living in a material world. We are created from the earth for the earth, as we learned in Genesis, and so we need food, we need resources, and we need the things. But of course, we need to realize that God is the ultimate provider for everything. So we have a need for material things, but then there's an extreme that goes the other way, where you have these preachers, prosperity preachers, that talk about having an overabundance, where we're worried about our wealth and not worrying about giving to others. And most of the time, these prosperity preachers are asking you to give to them. They're not really willing to give to anybody else. So there's a balance between saying, having this negative undertones when we talk about material things, and then having this idea that, um, a total focus on material things. So that leads me into the next thing that I think we have problems with, and that's with traditions. It seems to me that if you look in most churches today, um, more of the progressive type churches, traditions are looked down upon. Um, they don't want to have like a dress standard. They don't want to have, certain standard of conduct. Um, it used to be that in churches Christians didn't drink, and that was an expected conduct. Now that's not. It used to be in churches that people would dress up for church, and that's not accepted anymore. And so we've looked at traditions as a bad thing. And seemingly, I think there's two reasons that we have maybe come to this conclusion at time. Jesus often um, put down traditions, but he called them the traditions of men. And the reason why, if you're carefully examining when he's talking about this, he's not against tradition. In fact, we'll get into a little bit more about that. But what he's against is when tradition gets in the way of doing what God wants us to do. And so traditions aren't wrong. In fact, they're good. If you do not have a tradition in your church, traditions in your church, then you basically have a free for all, and you can end up with anarchy. Now, people look at traditions like as being legalistic. And this is another problem with today's Christianity. Legalism is not having traditions or standards by which a church body would conduct itself by, or you personally having standards of conduct and things that you will and will not do. What legalism is when those standards and those rules or principles that you're living by become so important that they override what God would have you to do. If a person walks into the church not dressed appropriately, and you make them feel uncomfortable, you judge them by their clothing, then you're not showing the love of God, and you're letting your standard get in the way of that. But on the other hand, having a standard of dress for those who are regular members, an acceptable way of dressing, I mean, you can get legalistic where it's down to the nth detail, but some acceptable standards of dress or of conduct, the things you do, like, you know, um, if you're not allowed to bring drinks into the auditorium, or some churches want it to be quiet prior to the service, and so if you walk in the auditorium, it's to be quiet. Well, and you think what ends up happening here is a lot of people have interpreted legalism as anything you tell me to do that I don't like. If I don't like it and you're telling me I have to do it, then you're a legalist. And that's not legalism, what legalism is. So a church without traditions is lost. It doesn't have the standard of conduct, the organization, that which defines it as being what it's supposed to do. Every other business, sports team, or anything has certain standards of acceptable conduct and what needs to be done. And Paul was not against this. Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 3:6, "Now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourself from every brother who walketh disorderly." So there is a sense that Paul wants to have some order in the church. And it says, "Walketh every brother that walketh disorderly, and not after traditions which ye have received of us." So Paul obviously gave the churches he went to some sort of traditional conduct that they needed to adhere to, that he wanted them to. And if a brother or a sister just refused to follow these rules, then they were being disorderly. So this is something that we need to be aware of in our churches today, and we need to be willing to go along with things sometimes we may not like, we may not understand, but we do it to have order and decency within the body. And so there are these traditions. Now, real quick, the one of the reasons Paul said we were free from the law wasn't because he was saying the law was bad and God had put all these restrictions on the Israelites to make their life miserable. It was rather because Jesus sent the disciples out into all the world. He sent us into all the world, which meant other cultures than the Jewish nation and the way the Jewish lives. And then after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, that all disappeared. The sacrifices and everything were very hard to follow all those rules without a temple. And if you lived in Gentile nations, I mean, a large population of the Romans were slaves, and they couldn't tell their master, "Well, I have to keep the Sabbath. I can't work today." And the master would said, "Forget it. You're working today." And even today, that would be a case. And so trying to follow these rules that God gave to Israel in the past, in a different culture, in a different time, would be impossible for Gentiles going out into cultures that are opposed to these things. And so you have to navigate how you're going to fulfill the laws and the principles that are contained in the law. And this is what it deals with in his writings. And so I believe that instead of talking about with these undertones of gift giving as materialistic, we should be celebrating giving of Christmas gifts. Um, I know there's the commercialization of Christmas, and it bothers me a lot. But if we focus on the commercialization and gift giving in a negative light, then it's going to rob us of the joy of giving gifts. So I think that if we focus more and we talk more about the positiveness of giving gifts, then there wouldn't be so much materialism about it. We give gifts at Christmas time because we are celebrating that God sent his son. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Giving Christmas gifts is a tradition and a physical thing that we do to remind ourselves. Going back, in the Old Testament, God gave many, many laws of doing certain things. Even the hem of the garment was to be a blue hem, because God knows that if we do not have visual and tangible things to remind ourselves, we forget. And when the lady looked to Jesus and she touched the hem of his garment, she knew what that hem meant, because in the Old Testament, the blue hem meant the righteousness of God. And she was reaching out for the righteousness of God because it was symbolic of that. And so we need symbolic things such as giving gifts to remind us of what God did for us. And the Jews offer sacrifices constantly to remind them that they were sinners. And we need to give gifts to remind us that God gave the gift of grace and salvation. Another thing we do as Christians is we eat a physical piece of bread and drink physical juice to remind ourselves of the sacrifice that God has given to us. We also baptize in physical water. We do a physical act to demonstrate the principle of what's taken place in our life. So giving gifts should be a symbolic gesture of what God's done for us. Now, the gift of cost Jesus everything. And it even cost Joseph and Mary. It cost Mary had to have had some shame in her life for being pregnant and not being married. And Joseph knew he was going to be scrutinized by that. And then they had to travel while being pregnant. It wasn't easy on this couple, and it wasn't easy on God giving his only begotten son. So we have to put effort into giving gifts. When I was writing this, I thought of 2 Samuel 24:23 through 24. It says, all these things did Araunah, the king, as a king, give unto the king. And Araunah said to the king, the Lord thy God accept thee. And the king said unto Araunah, nay, this is talking about David, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which doth cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. David said, I'm not going to make an offering to God that doesn't cost me anything. And when we offer a gift to somebody, it should cost us. We shouldn't be looking, oh, Christmas is such a hassle. Giving gifts is such a hassle. It is a hassle, but that's the point. It was a hassle for God to do what he did for us, that Jesus come to the smelly, stinky, sinful earth to die for us. When we give gifts, it should be an offering to God. We're giving gifts to one another to remind ourselves of what God did. Because we can't give things to God.